But most of all, it was a handshake campaign. The strategy was simple: win big in the early primaries and turn that momentum into front-runner status. And so Carter took trip after trip to Iowa, whose caucus would kick off the primary season.
That's the worst part about running for president. I don't get to see my little girl.
And he became an almost weekly visitor to New Hampshire, site of the first primary.
Nice to see you again.
It's nice to be back.
His great asset was the fact that he was not part of the Washington culture.
Can our government be decent and honest and purposeful?
And that he was an obvious Mr. Clean at a time when Watergate was on everyone's mind. Second, he had this massive self-assurance. He was confident he could overcome obstacles.
My name is Jimmy Carter. I'm from Georgia. I'm going to be your next president.
You hope?
I hope. Yes, sir, that's what I'm here for. I hope to get you to help me.
In New Hampshire, Carter's campaign was working, and some of the credit went to the inexperience of his staff.
The truth is, in a lot of presidential campaigns, the people who run those campaigns do their best job the first time. And the reason they do the best job the first time is they're not wedded to the way they did things in the past. When he was a candidate, he was a masterful politician.
I'm an old hat at
He could remember every time he had seen you and what he had said and what you had said for years. He was that kind of politician's memory.
That was a good occasion, wasn't it? I really enjoyed that.
One secret weapon was the Peanut Brigade, enthusiastic friends from Georgia who volunteered in the New Hampshire snows.
Hello, are you Mrs. Call?
Yes.
I'm Dot Pageant.
And they'd love to hear us talk. And they'd say, "Oh, I know where you're from. You're from Georgia." And I would say, "Why, yes, honey, child, I sure am." We could really put one on if we wanted to.
If we had snow on the ground like this, we'd be paralyzed for a week. We couldn't get out of the house.
We had a list of every Democratic and independent voter in the state, and we called on every one of them.
I equate it to being like a missionary must feel, the zeal, the dedication.
And then that night, when we got back into the hotel, we would sit down and write everybody from a 1, 2, and 3 a personal letter.
And we mail them that night. I mean, it may be 3 o'clock in the morning before we got to bed, but we enjoy doing that.
If something happened during the day, like your big dog came to the door or something, we would mention that.
And these people, when we went back the second time, we often called on the same people again. And they'd say, "I remember you, you came to my house."
Jimmy won in New Hampshire, and then for the most part just kept on winning.
Just fine.
How'd you like Illinois?
Oh, I loved it.
But Carter was so successful that the voters began to tire of him.
He essentially locked up the nomination in Pennsylvania in April. Whereupon he became a de facto incumbent in the eyes of a lot of people, and they were sick of him all of a sudden. And he started losing primaries.
His basic stump speech was a call for good government and a surprisingly controversial statement, "I'll never tell a
I
lie."
hope that I can go out of office and people will say, well, he made a lot of mistakes, but he never told me a lie.
He was never a favorite of the reporters because he was a religious, morally upright type, and just kept saying, "I'll never lie to you," which was a signal that we should find out if he's lying.
And so a journalist came down to see Miss Lillian, and she invited the journalist in, sat her down, gave her some lemonade, and this reporter immediately said, "Now you're Jimmy Carter's mother. As a mother, are you going to tell me Jimmy never lies?" And Ms. Lillian said, "Well, he tells white lies, but my son's not a liar." She says, "Well, what's a white lie? You know, that's the same as a lying. So what you're saying is he is lying. What's a white lie?" And Ms. Lillian said, "No, white lie is a totally different thing." And the reporter pushing on this issue said, "How? What's the difference?" And Ms. Lillian said, "Well, do you remember when I said, 'Welcome to my home and how glad I am to see you'? Well, that was a white lie."
A controversy was ignited when Carter was quoted as defending ethnic purity in neighborhoods. Even though he'd argued for the right of anyone to live anywhere, he was charged with pandering to white ethnic voters.
I think it was a calculated remark intended to reassure ethnic European immigrants who are concerned about alien forces, blacks particularly, coming into their neighborhoods, that if Jimmy Carter got elected president, that would never happen.
The ethnic purity issue disappeared when many black leaders, beginning with Martin Luther King Sr., came to Carter's defense. And on July 15, 1976, long since assured of the nomination, Jimmy Carter arrived at the Democratic Convention in New York. He'd won 18 primaries, traveled 400,000 miles, and made more than 2,000 speeches. And now everyone knew him.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
Now he and his running mate, Walter Mondale, headed into the general campaign against President Gerald Ford. One small controversy erupted in September when Carter told a Playboy reporter that he'd felt lust in his heart in his years of marriage. For those skeptical of Jimmy Carter's faith, the quote seemed heaven sent.
Well, I think he was trying to explain his Christian religion, that God does not expect you to be perfect, that nobody's perfect, and I think it shows that he's human.
Meanwhile, Gerald Ford's campaign portrayed him as the true outsider who'd already reformed Washington.
There is a change that's come over America.
But Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon was still held against him. And in his debate with Jimmy Carter, he made an astonishing assertion that hurt him badly.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own?
On election day, it was excruciatingly close. But Jimmy Carter won. The closeness of the vote would make his job more difficult. But first, it was time to celebrate what still seemed an unbelievable feat.
So help me God.
On January the 20th of 1977, Jimmy Carter became the 39th President of the United States. And in an America all too recently under the sway of an imperial presidency, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter walked to the White House. The campaign politics were over now, and what some would call the even tougher Washington politics were about to begin. Jimmy Carter was president now, and from the outset he was determined to show that he would not play by Washington's rules, that his only mandate was to do what was right. It was not a way to win friends in Congress.
He gave the impression he didn't want to deal with these people. He came into town saying, I'm the leader of America, not the Democratic Party.
At the start of his 4 years, the president went directly to the people on the then critical energy crisis.
Simply by keeping our thermostats, for instance, at 65 degrees in the daytime.
But it would take the president a year and a half to get Congress to pass a much modified energy bill. That first year, Jimmy Carter also had to fight the Congress hard for a treaty he felt was a moral obligation, ceding to Panama control of the Panama Canal.
If he had not negotiated the Panama Canal Treaty, we wouldn't have been dealing with just Nicaragua and El Salvador. We would have been dealing with all of Latin America, and we would have had a war in Ronald Reagan's time.
And it was Carter's insistence on the moral high road that made human rights a key effort of his administration.
Introducing the whole concept of human rights into foreign policy. It was an important thing for this country. It was an important thing for us to feel better about our foreign policy.
Along with a reluctance to play politics, Jimmy Carter earned a reputation early in his administration as a micromanager, obsessed with the smallest details of government. Saturday Night Live imagined a postal worker dismayed over her faulty mail sorter, the Marvex 3000.
Well, Mrs. Horvath, Vice President Mondale and myself were just talking about the Marvex 3000 this morning, as a matter of fact. I do have a suggestion. You know the caliper post on the first grid sliding armature?
Yes.
Okay, there's a 3-digit setting there where the post and the armature meet. Now, when the system was installed, the angle of cross slide was put at a maximum setting of 1. If you reset it at the 3 mark like it says in the assembly instructions, I think you'll solve any clogging problems in the machine.
Oh, thanks, Mr. President.
There was a far more serious and painful threat to Jimmy Carter's reputation in charges of past financial misdealings by his longtime friend Bert Lance, director of the Office of Management and Budget. Jimmy Carter would stand by his friend through successive investigations.
Bert, I'm proud of you.
But Lance would resign under public pressure in September of 1977.
I accept Bert's resignation.
Although no charges were brought against Bert Lance, Jimmy Carter's promise to deliver honest and accountable government had taken a serious hit. A personal triumph for Jimmy Carter was, of course, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. Carter brought two implacable leaders, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, together at Camp David in September of 1978. The issues between the Middle Eastern leaders were nearly insurmountable, the dislike mutual. But Jimmy Carter nonetheless forged the signing of a framework for
We
peace.
heard the word shalom, shalom, many times, and I think the meaning of that word is clear. Now they embrace. What a picture, what a picture.
And that's a tribute to his doggedness, to just, hold on like a bull terrier until the other guy says, okay, I give.
After another 6 months and more tough shuttle diplomacy and an additional $5 billion in American aid, Jimmy Carter got Egypt and Israel to sign a formal peace treaty. It seemed unbelievable, this birth of peace where war had so long reigned. The president was less successful in his relations with the Soviet Union. His attacks on their human rights violations antagonized the Soviets, who then delayed signing an arms limitation agreement. When at last they did, Congress refused to ratify it. Whatever the rigors of his office, Jimmy Carter was also, of course, the father in our national family. And it was a family under intense scrutiny.
Anything you did outside was blown way out of proportion. So the White House became, the family, and upstairs became your little haven. They say it's like living in a fishbowl, but it's the most isolated spot in the fishbowl. Nobody gets there unless you invite them.
One family task was protecting young Amy from all the public curiosity.
The family worked hard to try to make her feel loved and give her a lot of time, because my parents obviously were stretched doing politics.
For President Carter, life inside the White House must have seemed a refuge from his mounting problems. By the summer of 1979, Jimmy Carter was trying to control raging inflation, skyrocketing oil prices, and rising unemployment. Then, in a major speech in July, he said the nation faced a crisis of confidence.
What can we do? First of all, we must face the truth. And then we can change our course.
He followed this by then asking for the resignations of his entire cabinet and senior staff, which again frightened everybody to death about what was going on here, and was he unbalanced, was the government in a crisis. That was all intended to get rid of 2 or 3 people. He wanted to get rid of Califano at HEW, he wanted to get rid of Michael Blumenthal at Treasury, 1 or 2 others, I guess Brock Adams, as I recall, Transportation. And that was the whole purpose of this. And the whole thing had an artificial quality to it.
In the final year and a half of Jimmy Carter's presidency, he faced the growing perception of an administration at sea and an increasingly hostile press. Some of Jimmy Carter's problems were not under his control. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the spread of Islamic fundamentalism made Washington seem ever more ineffectual. And at least one of the president's problems was in his own family. The press had long portrayed his brother Billy as a caricature of the rural Southerner.
Billy was one of the greatest raconteurs that ever lived. He always had funny stories to tell, and they would take them out of context. So it was a very difficult time for Billy.
And Billy's obvious drinking problems were becoming an embarrassment for the administration. Things certainly hit a low point when Billy returned from Libya to shower it with praise.
I never said anything except about Colonel Gaddafi's internal policies, which I think are great. The people there love him. I think he's doing a marvelous job with the country.
Then on November 4th, 1979, the event that would dominate the rest of Jimmy Carter's presidency.
Good evening. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner.
Week after frustrating week, month after month, the crisis dragged on. An outraged America cried out for a show of force. But Jimmy Carter insisted on trying to free the hostages without bloodshed, and nothing worked.
8 lives were lost in a bold but unsuccessful attempt to rescue the hostages in Tehran. They are still in captivity.
It was April of 1980, 5 months after the hostages were seized. The president had gambled on a rescue effort and lost.
Equipment failure in the rescue
Jimmy
helicopter.
Carter was applauded at first, but for many, the failed rescue attempt became a metaphor for the Carter White House. As the 1980 election drew near, Jimmy Carter's prospects did not look promising. Still, he beat back a challenge from Ted Kennedy to win the nomination in August. Carter began the general campaign season against his Republican rival Ronald Reagan, the definite underdog. Reagan's potshots met a receptive audience.
People have been telling me that Jimmy Carter's doing his best, and that's our problem.
Ronald Reagan was superb at getting his conservative message out, a message many wanted to hear.
Reagan was speaking for a lot of discontent in the country, And he conveyed this picture of strength and purpose, which people wanted, so that he was a perfect candidate to take out Carter.